Winnie Finn, Worm Farmer by Carol Brendler. Pictures by Ard Hoyt. Winnie Finn, Worm Farmer. Winnie Finn was earthworm crazy. She turned over stones all around Quincy County in hopes of meeting squirmy worms. After a rain, Winnie found worms on sidewalks and coaxed them back into their holes. On cloudy days, she took them for rides in her rickety wagon. And sometimes she even raced them. Winnie Finn knew that the biggest earthworm ever was 10 feet long. She knew that an earthworm has 5 hearts. And she knew which end was its head and which was its tail because the head always goes first when it moves. When spring came to Quincy County, Winnie started thinking about the Quincy County Fair. The fair had prizes for things like the best looking puppies, the best laying hens, and the best corn stalks. The best growing corn stalks. Winnie Finn wanted to win a prize, too. With the prize money, she could get herself a brand new wagon. Did they have a prize at the Quincy County Fair for the best worms?
Worms? Said Mr. Abernathy. Nonsense! There's no prize for worms. This year I'm raising corn. With the right fertilizer, my stalks will shoot up high enough to pluck their own raindrops from the clouds. If only I knew what the right fertilizer was, I'd share my prize with anyone who could bring me some.
Worms? Said Mrs. Yamasaki O'Sheridan. Don't be silly. There's no prize for worms. I'm raising Plymouth Rock hens this time. With the right feed, they'll lay so many eggs, we'll be eating omelets the size of rubber rafts for breakfast. If only I knew what the right feed was, I'd share my prize with anyone who could find it for me.
Worms? Said Mr. Peasley. Are you sure, Winnie? I don't think there is a prize for worms. This summer I'm raising Afghan pups. If I can make their coats smooth and sleek as slipper satin, they're sure to win a prize. If only I knew how to give them shiny coats, I'd share my prize with anyone who could tell me that.
Winnie Finn knew how to find the right corn fertilizer and the right chicken feed, and she knew how to give puppies shiny coats. It all started with worms. So she borrowed a seed crate from Mr. Abernathy, who reminded her, "You can't pin a blue ribbon on a worm." And then she asked Mrs. Yamasaki O'Sheridan for some chicken manure. She said, "There's no worm trophy, young lady." And when she asked to borrow Mr. Peasley's wash tub that he used for bathing his puppies, he said, "There's no best in show for worms, Winnie Finn." But Winnie didn't pay them any mind. Soon she'd be sharing their prizes. Soon she'd have a brand new wagon. "First, I'll make a worm farm," said Winnie Finn. She filled Mr. Abernathy's crate with soil, strips of newspaper, and leaves. That would be the worm's house. She mixed in Mrs. Yamasaki O'Sheridan's chicken manure. That would be the worm's food. Then she filled Mr. Peasley's wash tub with water and poured it over everything. "This will keep the worms moist and help them breathe," said Winnie Finn. Winnie found all the red wigglers she could. She spread them all over their new home and watched them slither into the soil. For weeks, Winnie Finn watered her worm farm. She fed the worms eggshells, coffee grounds, and carrot peelings. She took them for walks and she sang to them. She even tried to give all of them names, but it was hard to tell them apart, even for Winnie Finn. She's got a list of names. Wormiest J. Worm, Wormykins, Kermit the Worm, and Pete Moss. Pete Moss. Oh. Finally, the worm farm was ready. Winnie found Mr. Abernathy watering his corn crop. "I have a present for you." Oh, wait, no, that's Winnie talking. "I have a present for you, Mr. Abernathy," she said. "Spread this around your corn. You'll have corn stalks tall enough to pluck their own raindrops from the clouds." Sure enough, a few weeks later, the corn was taller than Winnie. "Winnie Finn, you were right. Worm fertilizer was just what this corn needed. How can I thank you?" "Some corn would be nice, Mr. Abernathy." Winnie took the corn to Mrs. Yamasaki O'Sheridan. "I have something for you," she said. "Feed this corn to your hens. You'll have plenty of eggs for omelets the size of rubber rafts for breakfast." Sure enough, a couple of weeks later, Mrs. Yamasaki O'Sheridan's hens were laying so many eggs that she had to scramble to keep up. "My goodness, Winnie Finn, fresh corn was just what my darlings needed. However can I thank you?" "With eggs, please, Mrs. Yo." Winnie Finn gave the eggs to Mr. Peaslee. Mix these in with your puppy's food," she told him. "They'll have coats as smooth and sleek as slipper satin." "Thank you, Winnie. You're so clever. I'll mix some right this minute." On the day of the Quincy County Fair, everybody came to see who would take first prizes. Winnie kept her fingers crossed for the judging of the tallest cornstalk, the best egg layer, and the prettiest puppy. And Mr. Abernathy's cornstalks, Mrs. Yamasaki O'Sheridan's Plymouth Rock hens, and Mr. Peaslee's Afghan pups all took first prizes. Thanks to Winnie Finn and her worm farm. And with her share of the prize money, Winnie picked out the best new wagon in Quincy County. And on her way home, she couldn't help but notice Mrs. Alluvial's drooping dahlias, Mr. Yorkington's Smith Smythe's second-rate Rhode Island reds, and Mrs. Marcantoni's lackluster Lhasa Apsos pups. Winnie would have to find more worms. Let's read the author's note also. Here we have, the author says, "Imagine just 1,000 manure worms, also known as red wigglers or red worms. A plastic bin and some soil can make someone like Winnie Finn a hero. I have a worm farm in my backyard and you can start one too. Here's what you'll need. A 12 to 14 gallon or 45 to 53 liter plastic tub that's at least 8 inches deep or 20 centimeters deep and that it has a lid. Soil, you'll also need soil and strips of newspaper from only the black and white pages. You'll need dried manure from the garden center or any place where you can find dried manure. Water, enough to keep your worm's world as moist as a damp sponge. A pound of worms, red wigglers work best. Bread crusts and fruit and vegetable scraps from your lunch. Now find a shady spot outside or a cool place in your basement to keep your bin. If your bin is outside, keep the lid on so other animals can't get in it.
Fill your bin with newspaper strips on the bottom, then soil and dried manure, then a few more newspaper strips on top. Moisten everything in the bin, but be careful not to make it too wet. Dump the worms out into the bin and watch them wiggle and wiggle into the soil. You can start mixing food into the bin right away. Worms love pieces of fruit, even the peels. Eggshells, carrot scrapings, pasta, bread crusts, and cereal, beans, and even used tea bags, coffee grounds, and filters. My worms love espresso. Don't feed them meat, fish, dairy, or very salty foods. Don't overfeed them. Just a handful every few days is plenty for 1 pound of worms. Add a little water when necessary to keep your worms moist. After 2 or 3 months, your worms will have turned the soil almost completely into worm castings. It's time to tip your worm farm out into the garden and start again. And there's some sources here, some books to refer to. One called Earthworms, and then a website called 3 Trees Farm, redwiggler.com. And then there's more about worm farming, a couple other resources here. A book called Worms Eat Our Garbage, and another website for Happy D Ranch, happydranch.com. And I'm sure there's other ones out there too. The end. If You Hold a Seed by Ellie McKay. To my mother, who finds magic in the smallest of places. To my father, who showed me the potential of a tiny seed. If you hold a seed and make a wish and plant it in the ground, something magical can happen. And if there is some sun and some rain, it will begin to sprout. And if you wait and wait, you will see some little buds and tender leaves. When summer comes, there might be a bee, or perhaps a butterfly, and they will spread some magic. But when autumn comes, all its leaves will fall. Then you will have to wait through all the winter days until spring. The tree will grow with buds of gold and green. Birds will come to perch, perhaps to sing. The tree will soak in the summer sun and rain. Then, when autumn comes again, it will lean into the wind. And if you wait and wait, season by season, year by year,
That tree will grow so large, it will hold you. And if you wait some more, one day your wish will come true. Yucky Worms by Vivian French, illustrated by Jessica Alberg. And look, here's the worms on the front cover, and they're saying something.
We're not yucky. I'm very nice.
How rude. Yucky Worms by Vivian French, illustrated by Jessica Alberg. One day when I was in Grandma's garden, Grandma dug up a slimy, slithery, wiggly worm.
Yuck, I said. Throw it away.
Throw it away? Grandma looked horrified. Would you throw away one of your friends?
You can't be friends with a worm, I said. You can't even tell which end is which.
Yes, you can. Watch. Grandma put the worm down. It gave a kind of squirmy wriggle and disappeared really fast, pointy end first. As the rounded end vanished, Grandma said, "There goes its tail." I bent down to look, and I could see it had left a little tunnel. "Where did it go?" I asked. "Home," Grandma said. "It's an earthworm. It lives underground." In most backyards, there will be about 15 worms in every square yard of soil.
This is my mouth where food goes in,
the worm at the bottom picture says in the diagram. And here is esophagus, where the food goes next. Brain. Hearts. Worms have 5 pairs of hearts. There's a crop, where the worm stores food. And a gizzard, where the food is ground down. A clitellum, a pale ring found only on adult worms. The skin of the worm is covered in mucus for easier wriggling. And inside, on the lower part of their body, the intestine, where goodness from the food is absorbed into the bloodstream. And all the way to the end, where the worm says,
"And this is my bum where poop comes out." But what does it eat? Dirt? I wanted to know.
"It eats tiny, tiny stones and bits of dirt," Grandma told me. "But worms eat other things too, like rotting leaves and flowers and fruit and dead insects. They especially like eating at night when it's cool. The stones and dirt help to grind everything up in the worm's stomach, and then the worm poops it back out." Worms come above ground to find things to eat too. They pull their food back down as they wriggle into the ground again.
Ooh, nice and rotten, just how I like it. Moldy.
Dirt is good for you.
Yuck, can't eat this.
This one's sleeping. Grandma pointed at the flower bed. "Look, can you see?" I bent down and I saw what looked like a weird long curly worm made of dirt. "That's worm poop," Grandma said. "It's called a cast. You know when you recycle things?
Well, worms do it too. There's still a lot of goodness left in the things a worm eats, and when the goodness comes out again as poop, it helps plants to grow big and strong. And as the worms move around under and on top of the soil, the poop gets spread around the garden. That's why worms are my friends. Grandma gave me a thumbs up. And it's not just their poop that's good for plants. The tunnels they dig loosen the soil so roots can stretch out and air and rainwater can get in. Worms' poop is so fine and crumbly it never blocks their tunnels. In a square yard of soil, there will be about 4 yards of earthworm tunnels. Some people call worms underground farmers. Worms can wriggle backward and forward. Wriggle, wriggle, wriggle. Oops, forgot something. Better reverse. But it's dangerous being a worm, Grandma said. I stared at her. Dangerous? I asked. She smiled at me. Lots and lots of animals think worms make the most delicious dinner. Birds love them, and so do moles, badgers, frogs, hedgehogs, and foxes. Even some slugs eat worms, and human beings accidentally slice through them with spades and spike them with forks. It's a tough life. Cutting them in half doesn't hurt them, Grandma, I said. They just turn into 2 worms and keep on growing. Grandma shook her head. Poor worms. Lots of people think that, but it's not true. She put her fork down. Time for a snack. A worm's tail can regrow if it's cut off, but cutting a worm in half will kill it. Here's a worm at the top here that's saying, oh, that was close. Here's a mole with a shopping list. Worm, 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 worm. There's a mole over there. Oh, bird alert. I think I'll hide down here. Grandma had tea and I had orange juice. Can I dig up a worm? I asked. If it rains, Grandma said, the worms will come up on their own. I took a cookie. What if it doesn't rain? Grandma winked at me. We'll use the watering can and pretend. I finished my cookie as fast as I could. Can we trick the worms now? Worms breathe through their skins. They don't mind the soil around them being wet, but if their tunnels are flooded, they come up to the surface to move around more easily. Grandma filled the watering can and I watered the ground. Then I stood back. I didn't want worms chewing at my shoes. They only put their heads out, Grandma promised, and it'll be a while before they do. When it's very hot and the soil gets too dry to slither through, a worm will wriggle down to where the soil is still damp, curl up and wait for rain. When it's very cold, a worm will wriggle down even deeper, below the frost level, and curl up with other worms for warmth. Oh, look, this one's saying, whoo, as they go deeper. That's better, as they go deeper. And oh, a bunch of worms at the bottom here, and one says, oh, cozy. Grandma was right. I had time to eat 2 more cookies before she said, look. Wow, I said. I could just see the tip of a worm above the ground. Now watch this. Grandma stamped her foot and the worm disappeared. Did it see you? I asked. Grandma shook her head. Worms don't have eyes. They feel vibrations, though, and a thump like that might mean a hungry bird is landing. Danger. Grandma dug her fork in the ground. Up came lots of dirt and wriggly worms. She picked one up and washed it in the watering can. "Mustn't drop it," she said. "They can't swim." Grandma put the clean worm on some paper and held it near my ear. I could hear a tiny rustling noise. "What's that?" "They're covered in little bristles," Grandma said. "The bristles and their muscles help them move." A worm has ridged muscles all along its body. To move, it pushes its front end forward.
Wow, look at those bristles.
And uses its bristles to hold that end in place while the back catches up. The bristles on the back end keep the worm from sliding backward, while the front end tunnels forward again into the earth.
Away I go.
I've got muscles too. I bent my arm so Grandma could see. "If you've got so many muscles," she said, maybe you'd like to help me plant my sunflower seedlings." "Okay," I agreed, and then I thought of something. "When I go to school on Monday, I'm going to say that I've got lots of new friends." "Good idea," Grandma said. "But," I said, "I might not actually say they're worms." How to be a wormologist. Look for worm casts in your garden or in the park, leaves sticking up out of the ground, worms on the surface after it rains. Experiment by watering a dry patch of grass or dirt and watching to see if worms come up. Tapping on the ground to see if you can make a worm believe it's raining. Carefully digging up a fork full of dirt and counting how many worms you find. A worm in the hand. When you pick up a worm, remember to be respectful. A worm is a living creature. Check out how it feels. Is it smooth? Is it slimy? Can you feel the bristles? Watch how it moves. Is it a youngster or an adult? Adults have a clitellum, a yellow ring around their body. Put the worm back on newly dug soil and watch how it wriggles away. Always wash your hands after touching worms. Index. Look up the pages to find out about all these wormy things. And don't forget to look at both kinds of words. This kind and this kind. And here's the index, so if you check out this book sometime, then you can reference by easily looking in the back here and finding the information, the word that you'd like to look up, and then go to the pages listed next to that word to find out more about worms. The end. Winnie Finn, Worm Farmer by Carol Brendler, pictures by Ard Hoyt. Winnie Finn, Worm Farmer. Winnie Finn was earthworm crazy. She turned over stones all